Recently, Bruce and I went to Boston where we attended the MIT Bitcoin Expo, chatted to some great people such as core developer Eric Lombrozo. That was pretty fun.
Yeah, it's great. Eric's a great wealth of knowledge. He's been a core developer for a long time. So he's a perfect person to talk about the difference between GitHub and Git, how decisions are made, how commits are made, how the security works, how the whole thing behind Bitcoin works.
Bitcoin core and being a Bitcoin developer is sometimes unnecessarily shrouded in a lot of mystery. You know, you have this elite team of people who are managing this code, and I think that once you actually start to explain how it all works, it becomes very clear and transparent pretty quickly.
Yeah, the specifics of Bitcoin and the way that the open source decisions are made and the interaction with miner, it's very unusual in the world. So it's sort of, some of it is counterintuitive depending what your background is, and understanding how these decisions are made, how consensus is made, what power developers have or don't have. These kind of things aren't really easy to understand unless you either come from that background or look into it more and learn.
You had a great conversation with him. Here it is.
Starting at the basic level, for somebody who's just coming into this space, how are decisions made at Bitcoin? Who's in charge, if anyone? How does it work? Explain it in layman's terms.
At the base layer, you have basically repositories. People can contribute code, and they can own their own repositories. They can fork repositories. They can create their own repositories, and anyone can contribute to repositories or submit pull requests where they can get other people to submit the proposed changes and to see whether or not the maintainers of that particular repository are willing to merge it in. You can always grab a repository, if it's open source, fork it, create your own fork of it, and if you're able to maintain it and you develop a larger developer base than the original project, in principle you could become a more dominant force than the original project you forked off of. I think that a lot of people misunderstand the nature of how this works, and especially when it comes to cryptocurrencies, because people throw around the term fork a lot, and forking code bases is very, very different than forking some money. When you're dealing with monetary policy and forking tokens and stuff like that, it's a completely different thing than just like forking some cool new UI for a word processor or something like that. One of the things that I really tried to work on is to make it easier to identify the level of compatibility requirements for different proposals. So one of the things I did was BIP 123. The Bitcoin improvement process. This was a proposal to have every single request that actually modifies the protocol in any way to have to specify how what the compatibility requirements, or how severe the compatibility requirements were. So the very base layer, you have something like the consensus layer, where changes in or disagreements there would basically fork the ledger. You'd have completely incompatible ecosystems where they can no longer communicate. I mean, they could bridge the networks. You could have exchanges that can exchange between the tokens, like we've seen with forks, but
breaking the ledger is bad.
Well, it definitely puts more into question whether we can really call it money, right? So this is a huge point of misunderstanding. I think initially people were thinking that they could fork repositories like the Bitcoin repository and create a new coin with that, and it's the same as if you're forking OpenOffice or you're forking Linux or whatever else. It's completely different. In the case of Linux, yeah, sure, you have to have some compatibility because you want to have interoperability and be able to run the same applications, but people could make their own modifications and they could introduce certain incompatibilities, and in some cases that might even be a feature. You might not want to run certain things in certain flavors of Linux where you have greater security requirements or stuff like that, and that's fine. But in the case of something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general, you don't really have that luxury of being able to just do that and see if you can acquire a user base, because the network effect is significantly larger when it comes to money.
How much do you look at some of these chain forks, Bitcoin Cash and the things that have forked from those forks? Do you look at any of those repositories? Do you look at it? Is there any good code on there that Bitcoin developers want to look at?
We should distinguish between code forks that actually branch off of the Bitcoin code base, right, and projects that basically develop their own new code base from scratch. Right. And I've worked on both of those. I worked a little bit on Litecoin, which is an example of one that forked off the Bitcoin repository. Mm-hmm. I actually built my own version of Bitcoin Core that could support different currencies. We can actually change the network parameters easily in a config file. I don't know if it's a really good idea to actually be using that, but it was an idea where you could actually just make it very, very flexible, so you could just automatically change the parameters that you want and create your own new coin. And I've also worked on other ones which are complete ground up implementations. I worked on Ethereum, and I also worked on Ripple, which became something that is very different from what I initially thought that it might might become.
Interesting.
Yeah, so and in these cases, I think that you have, and you also have examples like Monero or Grin, or these are really, really interesting projects where you really do have novelties in the coding. But in something like Litecoin, I mean, Litecoin honestly is just basically a clone of Bitcoin with some parameters changed.
Right.
So it's not really like you have any key innovations in Litecoin that's like, oh yeah, we want to adopt that in Bitcoin too. No, it actually goes in the other direction. Things are implemented for Bitcoin. In the case of SegWit, we saw it deploy on Litecoin first just because of the politics that existed there, but it's not like that technology really came from Litecoin at all. So we need to distinguish these things.
What would happen if somebody could take control of the GitHub, and would that affect Bitcoin if Vladimir or someone else went off the rails and put something in there? What are the risks around that? I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding between GitHub and the actual code that's run on the miners.
Sure, so first I think we should distinguish between Git, which is an open source tool written by Linus Torvalds, a Linux developer, and it's a tool that he actually needed to work on the kernel for Linux, right? So it's just a tool. Anyone can run it on their own computer. There's no website for it where everyone uses it or anything like that. Then there's GitHub. GitHub is a specific website where you can post, you can push your repositories to, and you can collaborate with other people. You can post comments on stuff. You can review code together. And have inline comments in the code and stuff like that. It's a lot of really good features for collaboration. But the code repository itself actually lives on your own computer. So when you actually work on something like Bitcoin, you download the entire repository to your local drive. You work on it locally. You can add whatever changes you want. If you're collaborating with other people on something, at that moment you actually don't post anything to the main repository that everyone's accessing. You just share repositories between each other, and you just pull off of each other's latest pushes. So basically, it's important to make that distinction first of all. So in the case of Git, say that, for instance, some developer goes rogue and starts to insert all sorts of stuff into the code base. Other developers can just fork the code base, and if they can pull a large amount of the development community along with them and the rest of the network along with that, right? First of all, let's also distinguish between consensus changes and network, protocol changes and stuff that's just maybe some dispute over some feature, like they want the color of the background and the UI to be different. I'm just saying something stupid, but just to make the point. In that kind of a situation, really, it doesn't really matter. If people want to fork the code and add their own customizations to Bitcoin Core and tweak it so that it does something else special or whatever, that's totally fine. And I don't think that anyone's really against anything like that. It's only when you start to have incompatibilities where you can either get network partitions, or in the worst of cases, you get ledger forks and entire splits of communities. Or I don't want to really call it communities because they don't necessarily get along. It's just people that use the basic currency, right? You have splits of the ecosystem, and I think that economically that's a very costly thing, right? It's important that we distinguish that, because in the case of GitHub, GitHub is a centralized website. Now it's owned by Microsoft. In principle, they could try to censor it. I think that if Microsoft were to try to push code repositories off for whatever reason, people would just build a different site, and that would start to gain more traction. So I think that they're disincentivized to really try to crack down that way. But in principle, they could inject stuff. I mean, since they control the website, they could inject stuff into the code. But fortunately, there are ways of signing code so that you know actually which developers submitted what. There's accountability for that, and you can sign the code releases as well. You can have a build process which is pretty safe, so you know that the executables you're getting are actually compiled from the source code that you're looking at, so you know that people didn't insert all sorts of Trojan horses or viruses or who the hell knows what else into the code. So GitHub is centralized, but there's ways to route around it if it became a problem. Git is decentralized, nobody controls it. Even if Vladimir were to inject stuff, I seriously doubt that he could really get away with it, because it would be very, very obvious, and right away people would start to take action to route around that.
Right. And nobody would run it anyway, right?
Right.
I think a lot of people don't really understand how complex, particularly Bitcoin development is, because there's just layers and layers of security-driven complexity, and so sometimes people come in with ideas that they think are going to be well received, and it doesn't always work well. What is your advice to somebody who's sort of new and interested in Bitcoin development to avoid that problem?
Well, first of all, I think it's just a general problem with social networks. The fact that people are not in the same room together, and it's not like you're going to get your ass kicked if you say something mean to someone, right? Or at least not physically. People tend to kind of be a little more explicit about how they confront people. It's not something that's specific to Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. People talk about toxicity in the community or whatever. I think that that's just it's a cop-out. It's just not wanting to accept the fact that there's a deep human issue that needs to be addressed here that has absolutely nothing to do with the technology. People are going to do this anyways, and I think that people just need to understand that if you want to contribute something, you need to develop your own following. You need to promote it yourself. No one else is going to promote it for you. And if people don't want to use it, you just have to accept that sometimes it's not going to work, right? And not take it personally. There's such a strong, such a large network that is actually fighting off threats. There's more security threats reported to Bitcoin, the people working on Bitcoin than any of these other projects by far. And Bitcoin developers in general are way more proficient. Just let's be honest, they're way more proficient at the security aspects of dealing with this stuff in general. I'm not saying that there aren't good developers working on other stuff too, but just because of the fact that it's had to withstand much more serious attacks for much more prolonged periods of time, and there's a lot more money at stake.
And the open source nature of it makes it so that it's incentivized for people. If you find a flaw, if you're messing around with the code tonight and you find a flaw that nobody else found, which is possible because there was one just back in October, right? You have every incentive in the world to immediately fix that and let other people know, and you want to get it fixed. Whereas if you were CEO of Eric Coin and you had a big pre-mine, your moral incentive would be to fix it, but your financial incentive would be like, we got a problem. I got to have a secret meeting with my developers and figure out how we're going to spin this and how we're going to handle it.
The damage control becomes more important.
And then fix it. And damage control becomes more important than security.
Right.
And in Bitcoin, it's the opposite. Even people who can't stand each other, if it's a matter of real security, the whole community is going to band together and fix that. So that's something you won't see. And the critical mass of how many developers are there now? 500 or something? It's been increasing quite a bit as far as people who've contributed. So
and that's just people that have contributed to the actual Bitcoin core repository.
Right.
There's a lot of other people that contribute to other repositories, other libraries that people use, other projects or other things that are used as test frameworks or as test nets for different ideas. So there's a lot of other development besides just the stuff that happens on the Bitcoin core repository. And there's other repositories too that are not Bitcoin core that also support similar consensus rules. So it's not just the number of developers. It's also the fact that it's really hard to get them all to agree on a very specific special interest of a particular nature. And in the case of a corporation, you do have very special, very specific interests that you might have. Whereas here, it's really hard to do this and not get called out. So someone's going to call you out because you can't fire anyone. So someone's going to call you out.
And there's very little that everyone agrees on. Even the 21 million, there's a couple weirdos who don't really agree with that. And I think that's a good example of anything that doesn't have 20 million wouldn't really be Bitcoin. There's just no way you could have that be a non-contentious. I mean, everything's contentious basically. So it's sort of like there isn't anything that would change the way the ledger works that wouldn't be contentious, right? Unless it was a really, really major security issue.
Well, at this point, I think that it's kind of getting to that. I think in the beginning, it might have not been so much like that when it was much smaller. When you have a much smaller network, obviously it's much easier to push out changes and get everyone to upgrade and stuff like that. And when you don't have so much money at stake, then people don't really care. Now people get a lot more emotional about this kind of stuff. And even if you have a change that doesn't necessarily have a detrimental effect directly, people can still spin it in a way for political reasons to divide people and to inject all sorts of wedges. And people do that all the time. So I'm skeptical in terms of human nature a lot in that. I think that people are going to tend to do that stuff, and it's a question of whether the system can really survive that. And I think it's important that a lot of people in Bitcoin don't necessarily like each other, because if everyone likes each other and kumbaya and we're all in this together, it becomes too cultish, and people tend to start start going into self-deception. You need to have people that challenge you and say, hey, you're wrong.
Right.
And if you don't have that, it doesn't make you any stronger. You're actually going to get weaker over time.
The adversarial environment is the strength.
Absolutely.
Because it's the opposite of sort of saying yes to a leader.
Right.
Which would be bad security, and we see that with other projects where it's sort of leadership driven. You've been an attendee of the roundtable. We all care about privacy a lot, so most people shouldn't care about a private meeting. Yet the fact when you have a private meeting, and especially a popular one with a lot of people, and then on top of that limited in space, that kind of creates concerns that there's some sort of, it sort of sounds like the old world's kind of secret meetings. What are your thoughts on, meetings in general and privacy and this kind of thing?
There's definitely a place for people to meet in private and discuss stuff and to be able to come up with their own particular ideas or whatever. Those kinds of environments facilitates communication that would be much harder, especially online where people talk about toxicity. When you're in person with people, it's much harder to call them an asshole or something.
Right.
So it's something where I think that it does kind of bring a little bit more civility at that moment. And it helps communication there, but I think that any decision that actually impacts the entire community should be discussed openly on public mailing lists or open forums and stuff like that. And it's very important that people are able to express their concerns and reservations.